Late August 1944, somewhere in the dusty bocage of northern France, a German anti-tank crew waits in the damp shadow of a heavy hedgerow. They only need to break the legs of the vanguard. The logic governing this tactic was universally understood: dirt-packed bolts, using the boom of a heavy wrecker truck to hoist hundreds of pounds of ruined steel, dripping with contaminated gear oil, out of the hull and into the mud. But stripping away the dead metal is only the first step. A final drive assembly is an incredibly heavy, precision-engineered piece of machinery. It relies on perfectly milled gears, heavy ball bearings, and a massive outer casting capable of withstanding the immense torque required to move 30 tons of steel through the dirt. You cannot simply weld shattered gear teeth back together in a cow pasture. There are no heavy foundries hidden in the damp French woods to forge a replacement. To understand how this empty, gutted hull will drive back to the front line by tomorrow morning, we have to look at how American engines fundamentally altered the way a tank was built to be broken. The mechanics do not need a foundry in the French mud, because the M4 Sherman was not built like a bespoke piece of military hardware. It was designed from its inception around the philosophy of the American automotive industry. Unlike European tanks that often required custom hand-fitting of parts at the factory, the American medium tank was built on the concept of absolute, uncompromising standardization. It was not a single, unchangeable machine, but a collection of modular sub-assemblies. The engine, the transmission, and the final drive were not permanently integrated into the armored hull. They were self-contained components designed to be unbolted. A severed track on a 30-ton machine is not a flat tire on a supply truck. It is thousands of pounds of dead, interlocking steel, removed in one heavy piece and swapped entirely in the field. To replace the shattered final drive, the Ordnance Battalion relies on two distinct logistical pipelines. The first is the fleet of heavy supply trucks that trail the combat units, carrying crated, factory-fresh replacement assemblies. But the second, and far more ruthless source, is the battlefield graveyard itself. Parked just a few yards away in the same dark pasture is another Sherman. This vehicle suffered a catastrophic ammunition fire during an assault weeks ago. The turret is warped from extreme heat. The hull is scorched, cracked, and totally devoid of life. In the ledgers of the armored division, the vehicle is officially written off as an unrecoverable total loss. But the fire never reached the lower front glacis. Its final drive and transmission remain perfectly intact. Working through the night, a second crew of mechanics cannibalizes the dead machine. They cut away the safety wire, unbolt the massive outer housing, and use the boom of a heavy wrecker truck to hoist the donor final drive into the air. It drips with rain and old gear oil as the crane swings it slowly over to the tank, damaged in the roadside ambush. This is the exact moment where the invisible power of the American industrial system proves itself in the dirt. A final drive manufactured by a subcontractor in Michigan perfectly aligns with an armored hull welded by a completely different factory in Ohio that must be manually dragged and reconnected. If the armor-piercing shell has shattered the final drive, the heavy internal gearing that connects the transmission, the field mechanics do not need to file down the cast steel to make the pieces fit. They do not need to tap new threads or drill new holes. The bolt patterns match to the fraction of an inch. The heavy steel casing slides into the empty cavity. The mechanics torque down the massive bolts, seal the housing, connect the internal linkages, and fill the massive gears with fresh oil. By dawn, the triage is complete. Using a heavy manual track jack, the mechanics pull a salvaged length of steel track tightly over the newly installed drive sprocket. A welder drives a steel track pin home with a heavy sledgehammer to close the loop. The driver climbs into his seat and presses the starter. The engine catches, coughing thick smoke before settling into a steady, vibrating idle. He shifts the heavy levers into gear. The scavenged final drive translates the engine torque perfectly. The 30-ton machine backs violently out of the mud, pivots on its tracks, and begins driving toward the sound of the artillery. When the German anti-tank gunner sees this exact vehicle rolling toward his new position later that afternoon, he is not seeing a mechanical resurrection. He is seeing the mathematical result of an army that treats tanks as a collection of interchangeable parts. But this closed loop of recovery, cannibalization, and modular repair relies on a delicate geographical balance. The Ordnance Battalion must remain close enough to the fighting. To the tracks, the damage is catastrophic. The internal mechanical organs of the tank are exposed and ruined, to drag the wounded machines to safety, but far enough back to deploy their heavy equipment. The system functions brilliantly when the front line creeps forward, a few miles a day. The true test of this mechanical web is what happens when the enemy defense finally collapses. The armored column breaks out, and the spearhead suddenly sprints 50 miles in a single afternoon. To understand if this heavy, lumbering field factory can actually survive its own success, we have to look at the severe friction of a rapid advance. Late July, Operation Cobra. The German defensive line finally breaks. The American armored column is no longer crawling from hedgerow to hedgerow. It is suddenly sprinting across the open plains of Brittany and toward the Seine. The speedometer of the lead Sherman climbs to 25 miles per hour. They cover 40 miles in a single afternoon. The dust plumes rise hundreds of feet into the air. But speed is a mechanical killer. A tank is not a truck. Sustained high-speed driving violently grinds the steel track pins, overheats the radial engine, and shatters rubber road wheels. The vehicles begin to break down not from enemy fire, but from the sheer physical friction of the breakout. In a static battle, a broken tank is a local problem. The maintenance battalion is parked just 3 miles away. According to the standard doctrine of attrition, a tank suffering this level of trauma is removed from the war for weeks. It cannot move under its own power. But when the spearhead is advancing 50 miles a day, the geography of repair becomes a logistical nightmare. The massive ordnance vans, dragging heavy generators and loaded with cast iron tools, cannot keep pace with combat tracks. If a Sherman blows an engine on a country road 50 miles behind the vanguard, the recovery crew faces a dangerous dilemma. The territory between the crippled tank and the advancing front line is not fully secured. Bypassed enemy infantry still roam the woods. The mechanics had to adapt instantly to the friction of their own success. They abandoned the concept of a single, static field factory. Instead, the ordnance battalions fractured into specialized echelons. They created fast-moving contact teams. These were mechanics crammed into lightly armored half-tracks or open jeeps, riding directly behind the fighting tanks. When a vehicle threw a track or ruptured a fuel line during the sprint, the contact team did not tow it. They swarmed the vehicle right on the shoulder of the road, performing frantic, temporary fixes, while the rest of the column bypassed them at full speed. If the tank required heavy surgery, like a ruined engine or a seized transmission, the contact team simply marked the location on a map and left the crew behind. They relied on the heavy maintenance echelon, the slow-moving convoy of shop vans and wreckers. It cannot be easily pushed aside by a jeep or a standard cargo truck. In a traditional army, recovering it requires heavy industrial rail transport to sweep up the casualties hours or days later. This meant the rear mechanics were suddenly operating in a dangerous vacuum. Welders and riggers found themselves using their carbines to defend their portable machine shops against retreating enemy patrols. They were replacing final drives in unsecured town squares, working by the light of burning buildings. The rapid advance also severed the supply lines for factory-fresh parts. The legendary transport truck convoys racing from the beaches were prioritized to carry artillery shells and gasoline, not replacement tank transmissions. To keep the spearhead moving, cannibalization reached a ruthless scale. The recovery crews scoured the roadside for any destroyed American armor, stripping perfectly good engines, tracks, and road wheels from burned-out hulls before the heavy wreckers even arrived. They built a rolling inventory of scavenged parts, carrying them forward on the decks of their own recovery vehicles. This leapfrogging system of fast contact teams and heavy sweeping echelons allowed the American armor to maintain its terrifying momentum. The column never stopped. The factory simply moved behind it, leaving a trail of repaired tanks racing forward to rejoin the vanguard. But war is a mirror. Across the front line, the defending German army operated some of the most technologically advanced to haul the carcass back to a specialized rear echelon depot, or perhaps all the way back to a factory floor. In the meantime, the road is blocked, and heavily armed tanks in the world. As the battle shifted into a massive war of movement, the question was whether the opposing military possessed the same invisible machinery to sustain its own heavy armor under the brutal pressure of combat. Late August, on a congested retreat route toward the German border, a heavy Panther tank strains against the deep mud of a rain-soaked farm road. The transmission groans under the immense physical demand of moving 45 tons of steel. Without warning, a violent, metallic snap echoes inside the fighting compartment. The tank lurches and abruptly stops. The left final drive has sheared under the strain. The machine is a mobility kill, suffering the exact same mechanical trauma as the American Sherman days earlier. The Panther is an apex predator of tank combat. It boasts thick, sloped frontal armor and a high-velocity gun, capable of destroying an American vehicle from far beyond the Sherman's effective range. But war is not merely a series of static duels. It is a grueling mechanical marathon. When the German tank breaks down, its crew faces a radically different logistical reality than their American counterparts. The German armored philosophy prioritized superior individual combat performance over modular field maintenance. The Panther was a masterpiece of complex engineering, but it was not designed to be easily taken apart in a muddy pasture. To replace the ruined transmission and final drive, the American momentum is stalled. The defenders believe they have bought their forces precious days to regroup, confident that the Americans must now halt. Field mechanics cannot simply unbolt a modular front housing and slide a new unit into place. They must use a heavy, specialized gantry crane to physically lift the entire transmission assembly straight up and out through the roof of the hull. If the retreating unit does not have immediate access to a heavy crane, the tank cannot be repaired. The running gear presents an even greater obstacle. The Panther rolls on, an advanced system of overlapping, interleaved road wheels, which distribute the massive weight of the tank smoothly across soft ground. But if a single inner wheel is shattered by a mine or anti-tank fire, the crew cannot simply pull it off. They must systematically unbolt and remove as many as 5 outer heavy steel wheels just to reach the broken one. In the freezing mud, under the threat of advancing artillery fire, this task requires hours of exhausting labor. Even simply dragging the crippled machine out of the way becomes a tactical crisis. The American M32 recovery vehicle was built in massive numbers to match the Sherman. But dragging a 45-ton Panther requires immense mechanical torque. Specialized German recovery vehicles, like the turretless Berger Panther, are incredibly scarce. Under the desperate pressure of a retreat, the only way to move the dead tank is often to chain 2 functional Panthers to it and wait for fresh replacement tanks to travel hundreds of miles from the nearest deep water port. The ambushers retreat, marking the road as closed on their situation maps. This violates the basic limits of mechanical stress. The extreme dead weight routinely burns out the clutches and shatters the transmissions of the towing vehicles, instantly turning one broken tank into three, without a fast-moving echelon of heavy ordnance vans trailing just behind them, without universally interchangeable modular parts, and without the heavy transport network required for rapid field surgery. The German crew has run out of options. The commander gives the final order. They place thermite demolition charges over the engine block and the gun breech. They ignite the fuses and walk away, leaving a highly advanced fighting machine burning on the road simply because of a broken gear. This was the fundamental contrast in iron. The defending force possessed weapons capable of destroying any vehicle on the battlefield. But because their logistical system relied heavily on rear echelon railway transport and centralized factory infrastructure to heal heavy damage, almost every mechanical failure became a permanent subtraction. The American armor, despite taking heavy combat losses, continually recycled its own casualties. The defending military could see the physical result on the battlefield, but they could not replicate the machinery producing it. To understand the ultimate operational consequence of this hidden advantage, we must look at how field maintenance completely altered the brutal mathematics of armored warfare. Inside a blackout tent, serving as an armored division command post, an operations officer updates a situation map by the harsh light of a kerosene lantern. But 48 hours later, a new American spearhead assaults their next defensive line. As the German gunner peers through his optic to identify the approaching threats, he wipes away a grease pencil number representing the operational strength of a combat battalion that just suffered heavy vehicle losses in a brutal daytime assault. By the traditional rules of attrition, that unit should be severely degraded. It should be pulled off the line to wait for replacements to travel from the coast. Instead, the officer writes a new number that is only slightly lower than the day before. The vanguard will attack again at dawn. This simple grease pencil mathematics reveals the true operational weight of the American field maintenance system. In the grand strategic narrative of the war, the Allies possessed massive industrial capacity. Factories in Detroit and Ohio were pouring thousands of vehicles off assembly lines, but a manufacturing plant across the Atlantic Ocean cannot influence a battle happening tomorrow morning. A replacement tank sitting in the hold of a cargo ship or waiting on a crowded dock in Normandy is tactically useless to a commander who needs to punch through a defensive line today. The actual strength of an American armored division was not the total volume of tanks it brought ashore. It was the daily operational readiness rate generated by the mechanics. The defending German army often measured success by counting kills. If they disabled 20 American tanks, they calculated that the enemy thrust was permanently blunted. But the American ordnance ledgers tell a completely different story. Through the magnification of a gunner's optic, the narrow farm road ahead is empty. Then comes the sound. He sees a contradiction that defies the basic laws of wartime logistics. Rolling toward him is the exact same Sherman. A disabled Sherman was rarely a final statistic. It was simply placed in a temporary status. Because the mobile field factory operated just miles behind the vanguard, the turnaround time for heavy repair was measured in hours and days, not weeks. An armored battalion might lose 30% of its vehicles to mines, anti-tank fire, and mechanical breakdown during a violent, multi-day engagement. But while the battle still raged, the recovery crews were dragging the casualties backward, and the ordnance battalions were pushing repaired vehicles forward. The mechanics routinely restored half or more of those casualties within 48 hours. The net combat loss to the frontline commander was not 30%. It was heavily subsidized by the labor of the rear echelon. This invisible math created an overwhelming operational momentum. The American army did not merely outproduce the enemy in safe factories, it out-repaired them on the active battlefield. A single Sherman might hit a mine in June, suffer a shattered final drive in July, and take an armor-piercing round to the engine compartment in August. In another army, that equals 3 dead tanks. In the American system, it was the exact same machine, repaired and returned to the line 3 separate times. The defending forces were continually crushed under the illusion of infinite American numbers. They were not fighting a limitless swarm of brand new vehicles. It carries the identical bumper codes, the same painted unit insignias, and the same distinct scuffs on its hull. But the severed track is whole. They were often fighting the very same tanks they had already stopped, rebuilt from cannibalized parts, and pushed back into the fight. The logistical web absorbed the extreme friction of the campaign and allowed the combat tracks to simply keep rolling. But this system was not an abstract machine. A modular tank does not rebuild itself. A 30-ton steel carcass does not drag itself out of a muddy ditch under artillery fire. The daily readiness rate was paid for in physical exhaustion, raw muscle, and severe danger. To understand the true cost of this operational advantage, we must look at the men who spent the war covered in grease and blood, executing the repairs in the dark. The German anti-tank gunner hiding in the damp hedgerow believed he understood the rules of the war. He calculated that a shattered final drive and a violently severed track meant the American machine was permanently dead. He trusted the absolute logic of attrition. But when that identical 30-ton Sherman rolled out of the morning mist 48 hours later, fully repaired and advancing at combat speed, the gunner was not witnessing a miracle. He was watching the American maintenance echelon, operating at its brutal, invisible peak. The question of how the armored columns maintained their relentless momentum across Europe, the shattered final drive housing is perfectly intact. The machine that was left broken and bleeding oil in the dirt 2 days ago is alive. Was never really about the Sherman tank itself. It was not about indestructible armor or the infinite scale of deep water ports. It was about an entirely different kind of system. It was about an army that accepted that vehicles would inevitably break, burn, and shatter. And so it built an industrial recovery machine that lived just behind the vanguard. But a system is only a concept on a general's planning map. In the deep ruts of northern France, the freezing forests of the Ardennes, and the long, violent sprint into Germany, the system was entirely human. The daily operational readiness rate of the American armored divisions was not paid for by distant assembly lines in Michigan. It was paid for in exhausted muscle, sleep deprivation, and blood. The men who kept the spear point sharp did not wear the crisp uniforms of high command. They were soldiers whose hands were permanently stained with black grease, dried carbon, and toxic hydraulic fluid. When a recovery crew dragged a violently ruined tank out of a kill zone, they often had to wash the remains of the previous crew out of the fighting compartment before the mechanical triage could even begin. They operated under constant tactical threat. They worked in the freezing rain, lying on their backs in flooded pastures, using heavy sledgehammers to drive steel track pins, and it is attacking at full speed. This was not an isolated incident. Across the European theater, defending forces repeatedly traded lives, time, and ammunition. While artillery shells tore through the trees above them, they were riggers who crawled under 30 tons of unstable, shifting steel in the absolute darkness of blackout conditions. They were welders who struck arcs that made them temporary, blinding targets for bypassing enemy patrols. They were master mechanics who cannibalized, scorched, dead hulls, relying on sheer physical leverage, and heavy crowbars to unbolt massive cast-iron transmission blocks so that another crew could fight the next morning. They navigated the constant danger of unexploded ammunition trapped inside ruined turrets and the deadly, crushing weight of slipping cranes. They did not win the medals usually reserved for combat valor. They rarely appeared in the newsreels shown in civilian theaters back home. They operated in the exhausted obscurity of the rear echelon, yet they lived constantly on the razor edge of the front line. The opposing military could count the tanks driving toward their defensive lines, but they could never truly measure the hidden labor force sustaining the assault. They were fighting an army that simply refused to let its dead iron stay buried. When the final engine of the European war was shut down, the strategic victory did not belong solely to the generals, or even to the combat crews who fired the last rounds. To disable American armor, only to face the exact same vehicles in the very next battle. It created the illusion that the Americans possessed. It belonged just as much to the unnamed mechanics who stood in a muddy field in the middle of the night, lifting a heavy wrench under the dim glow of a shrouded flashlight, ensuring that when the sun came up, the tracks would roll forward again. A supernatural ability to resurrect dead steel overnight. To understand why the defenders' logical calculation failed so completely, we first have to understand the immediate reality of what happened on that dirt road the moment the smoke cleared, and how the Americans redefined what a dead tank actually meant. The echo of the anti-tank gun fades across the damp fields. The lead Sherman sits skewed at a violent angle, one track unspooled in the dirt. Smoke from burning brush mingles with the pale vapor of leaking transmission fluid. The surviving crew crouches in the muddy ditch, checking themselves for shrapnel, their ears ringing from the impact. For the American armored column stacked up tightly behind the crippled tank, it is a deep, rhythmic vibration, the heavy mechanical thrum of a 30-ton machine, accompanied by the high-pitched squeal of steel tracks grinding against dirt and stone. The immediate threat is not the loss of a single vehicle. The true danger is the loss of momentum. An armored spearhead relies on speed to survive. It must punch through the defensive line before the enemy can coordinate an artillery barrage. A blocked road transforms a fast-moving offensive into a stationary target. The protocol for this moment was rehearsed, ruthless, and immediate. It was battlefield triage. Just as a medic evaluates a wounded infantryman to decide if he can keep fighting, the tank crew and the accompanying company mechanics had to diagnose a wounded machine before the enemy could reload or adjust their fire. If the damage was relatively minor, such as a snapped track pin or a shattered road wheel, the crew was expected to fix it themselves. Using heavy sledgehammers, crowbars, and manual track jacks, 4 exhausted men working in the mud could physically winch the heavy steel links together and pound a new pin into place. It was grueling, desperate labor, often performed while mortar airbursts showered the road with dirt and hot steel. But the triage on this specific Sherman reveals a fatal diagnosis. The kinetic force of the German shell did not merely snap the track. It smashed completely through the heavy cast steel of the final drive housing at the front of the hull. Inside that thick armor, the heavy gears that transfer rotational power from the engine and transmission, the lead vehicle of an American armored column, rolls into the crosshairs. The gunner does not aim for the thickest armor on the turret. To the drive sprockets are shattered into jagged shrapnel. The internal mechanics are locked. The drivetrain is ruined. The machine is officially a casualty. The crew grabs their personal weapons, their maps, and their encrypted radio codes, abandoning the steel hull to walk back to the rear, or wait for a replacement tank. Yet the rest of the column cannot simply drive around the wreckage. In the high, dense hedgerows of the French Bocage, or on the narrow logging trails of the Hurtgen forest, there are no shoulders. The 30-ton mass of the Sherman is a steel cork in a very narrow bottle. To the German gunner watching from a distant tree line, this is the intended mathematical result. A 30-ton object devoid of engine power is practically immovable. You cannot push it out of the way with a standard transport truck. You cannot drag it with a reconnaissance jeep. To pull a dead tank with a live tank is strictly forbidden by doctrine, because the extreme dead weight risks burning out the clutch and snapping the transmission of the rescuing vehicle, instantly doubling the losses. In a civilian setting, moving a 60,000-pound mass of locked steel safely requires a heavy industrial crane, a reinforced flatbed trailer, and hours of careful rigging by specialized crews. But this is not a civilian setting. Artillery shells are actively ranging the road. He aims low, targeting the moving suspension. When he fires, there is no massive fireball. There is only a sharp, violent crack of kinetic energy shattering cast steel. The infantry is calling urgently for armored fire support miles ahead. The triage has determined the tank is dead, and the artery must be cleared immediately. The problem was physical and incredibly heavy. The Americans needed a way to forcibly drag 30 tons of immobile metal out of the line of fire, and they needed to do it in minutes, without destroying the vehicles trying to pull it. Through the lingering smoke, a new silhouette appears on the road. It drives on standard Sherman suspension and features the familiar sloping frontal armor, but it has no main gun. Instead of a rotating turret, an 18-foot steel A-frame derrick rests heavily over its hull. Inside the hollowed-out belly sits a massive engine-driven winch, capable of pulling 60,000 pounds of dead weight. This is the M32 Armored Recovery Vehicle. The men who operate it are not frontline assault troops. They are specialized riggers, welders, and mechanics. Yet their doctrine requires them to drive directly into the exact kill zones where combat tanks have just been annihilated. When the M32 reaches the shattered Sherman, the recovery crew faces the most dangerous moment of their operation. The heavy track snaps instantly, unspooling violently into the dirt. The Sherman violently lurches to the right, its engine screaming as the driver tries to overcompensate. To physically connect the two vehicles, a man must open his steel hatch, step out into the mud, and expose himself to the exact same snipers and artillery spotters that just stopped the advance. Working with practiced frantic speed, the riggers drag heavy, grease-coated steel towing cables across the dirt. They hammer thick, forged clevises into the towing eyes, welded onto the dead tank. There is no time for careful alignment. The rigger scrambles back inside the armored shell, sealing the hatch. The driver of the M32 throttles up the radial engine. Deep inside the hull, the heavy winch engages. The slack in the steel cables vanishes. They snap taut, vibrating violently under extreme physical tension. The dead Sherman's tracks are completely locked by the shattered final drive. Its internal gears are seized, but the sheer mechanical torque of the recovery vehicle overpowers the dead weight. With a deafening screech of tearing metal and displaced earth, the ruined 30-ton tank is forcibly dragged out of the dirt ruts. It slides heavily into the ditch, crushing thick hedgerow roots and tearing through the brush. The narrow lane is suddenly clear, before it grinds to a heavy, dead halt. The crew scrambles out of the hatches, diving into the ditches. The tank is not burning. The artery is open. The surviving tanks in the combat column rev their engines and surge forward, driving immediately past the smoking wreck to continue the assault. But the recovery crew's job is not finished. They are not simply a roadside clearing service. They are the harvesters of a mechanized graveyard. In many other armies, abandoning a dead tank in a ditch meant the end of its military utility. It would sit rusting until the campaign ended, serving only as a temporary bunker for passing infantry. or a source of scavenged machine gun ammunition. The American recovery crew operates under a completely different directive. They wait until the front line pushes a few miles forward, out of direct line of sight anti-tank fire. Then they return to the ditch. Using the heavy A-frame derrick, they hoist the shattered front end of the Sherman off the ground, bypassing the locked tracks. They begin a slow, grinding tow away from the battlefield. To the defending forces, watching from distant observation posts, this slow, sad procession looked like the beginning of a permanent withdrawal. The ammunition has not detonated, but for all practical purposes of combat, the vehicle is dead. It is a mobility kill. They assumed the ruined hull was beginning a long journey back to a strategic railway hub, eventually returning to a factory floor across the Atlantic. But the M32 is not driving to a train station. It is only dragging the dead tank a few miles down the road, stopping entirely within the sound of the artillery guns. To understand how this violently broken machine could possibly return to combat in 48 hours, we must look at the destination waiting just out of sight. 3 miles behind the fighting, out of direct line of sight fire but still well within the range of heavy artillery, the M32 turns off the paved road. It drags the crippled Sherman into a muddy pasture, concealed beneath broad sweeps of camouflage netting. The air here does not smell of burning cordite, but of hot grease, ozone, and heavy diesel exhaust. The dull roar of combat is replaced by the high-pitched whine of portable generators and the blinding blue flash of arc welders. This is the bivouac of an armored ordnance maintenance battalion. In traditional military doctrine, frontline logistics meant supply. The trucks and trains bringing rations, fuel, and ammunition to the guns. Heavy mechanical repair belonged in rear echelon depots near railway hubs. But the American system pushed actual, heavy industry directly into the tactical zone. These were not makeshift motor pools manned by exhausted drivers holding socket wrenches. This was a factory designed to the defending German commander. This is exactly what tactical success looks like. They do not need to incinerate every American tank to halt the offensive. Move on wheels. Parked deep in the tree line are rows of specialized 2.5-ton shop vans. Their rear canvas beds do not carry infantry. They house precision lathes, heavy drill presses, and industrial valve grinders, all powered by integrated electrical generators. Heavy air compressors and banks of oxyacetylene tanks sit chained to heavy-duty trailers. The men operating these tools are master mechanics, millwrights, and certified welders, men whose civilian hands built the industrial infrastructure of Chicago and Detroit, now performing heavy labor in the freezing rain. The M32 drops the ruined Sherman into the pasture. The triage is already complete. The ordnance crews swarm the armored hull immediately. They do not wait for daylight. Working under strict blackout conditions to avoid attracting night-flying bombers, they navigate the heavy steel by the Problamtaz. Dim, localized glow of shrouded flashlights, or the blinding, momentary sparks of their own cutting torches. They do not have the luxury of a clean concrete floor, a hydraulic lift, or an overhead factory crane. When a 30-ton tank sinks deeply into a muddy field, the mechanics must physically dig trenches beneath the hull with shovels just to reach the heavy bolts protecting the engine sump and the transmission housing. For this specific Sherman, the trauma is localized at the front right corner. The kinetic energy of the German shell has shattered the heavy cast steel casing of the final drive, violently destroying the internal reduction gears that translate engine power into track movement. Using roaring cutting torches, the mechanics shear away the jagged, twisted armor. They loosen dozens of seized,